The debate over parental rights taking center stage in New Jersey as public schools prepare to draft new lesson plans on gender identity for kids as young as 6. And some parents are now pushing back. Nate Foy's in Hoboken, New Jersey with the very latest. Hi, Nate.
Hey, Mike. Yeah, it's not just parents pushing back. A New Jersey congressman is already drafting legislation in response to this. We'll get to that momentarily. But first, I do want to point out we have reached out to New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy's office as well as the State Department of Education. We have not heard back. We will let you know when we do. But we'll tell you why parents here are concerned. Starting in September, kids as young as first grade will be talking about gender identity and their private parts in the classroom and how that relates to their gender identity. Fox News obtained a lesson plan. We want to show you part of it. It's called Pink, Blue, and Purple. Parents received this in the Westfield School District in late February, but this is under the state's new sex education guidelines. 6-year-olds will be taught about choosing their gender identity and how their private parts may not match their choice. The lesson also calls for teachers to ask kids how they know if they're a boy or a girl. Parents we spoke with say it's not the conversation itself they're against, it's the fact that they're not the ones having it with their children.
I think these conversations do need to be had. And I think it is important that we teach our children to respect everyone, no matter what their differences are. I just think that you need to know when a child is emotionally ready to have these conversations.
Mike, as I mentioned, New Jersey Congressman Jeff Van Drew is already drawing up federal legislation that would require schools to tell parents if gender identity or sexual orientation are being taught in the classroom. In a statement obtained by Fox News Digital, he said in part, quote, "Parents are outraged, as they should be. These policies and guidance are forcing parents out of the equation relating to their child's education and is government overreach at its finest." Again, as soon as we hear back from Governor Murphy or the State Department of Education, we will pass that information along. We'll send it back to you, Mike.
Nate Foy live in Hoboken. Nate, thanks a lot. The UK's Ministry of Defense says Russia is now aimed to boost its armed forces by re-enlisting some retired soldiers. Joining me to discuss Russia's endgame in Ukraine is John Venable. His friends call him JV, a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force and senior research fellow for defense policy at the Heritage Foundation. JV, great to have you.
Great to be back with you, Mike.
So take us to the map. What's the latest you're seeing in terms of developments on the battlefield?
Yeah, what a difference a week makes, Mike. Last week we had Russian forces concentrating in 3 different areas, basically north of Kyiv, then you had the Donbass, Luhansk region, and then down here around the Crimean Peninsula. And they were trying to link up that east side, really horrible defenses for the Russians and incredibly strong defenses for the Ukrainians, caused them to pull out. And now we've got basically 2 regions that are of the focus for Russians. And one of the big things that's associated with this, Mike, is you had 3 children to feed with logistical, munitions, supplies, and food to actually nourish those 3. Now we're down to 2, and with 3 different regional commanders last week. And now Russia has put a commander in with great experience from Syria, Dvonikov. And Alexander Dvonikov is now basically in charge of all of this. He can set the priorities, and he can show how the maneuvering should go and force his commanders to comply with that.
It sounds like he has a pretty vicious reputation, this new general. And so what does that tell you?
Well, the Russian way of doing business is rubbling. And you saw that in Syria with Idlib. Aleppo, how that city was leveled. And you're not going to see any change in the way the Russian tactics go, but what you will see is the concentration of forces and activities in this region. One difference that we saw last week with regard to the Ukrainian way of doing business, generally tactical. Generally, you're fighting in these regions force, short range, and actually in the unit level. But there's a small oil refinery just north of Kharkiv in this little saddle here on the north side, and that's called Belgorod. And Ukraine sent 2 hind helicopters in and basically leveled that place. More than half of the storage facility there was ruined, and the dissemination of oil in this region was basically shut down. And this is one where we call that air interdiction. It's going deep behind enemy lines and trying to shut down their logistical supply chains. If Ukraine can get more of this activity, now that it's got this freedom of maneuver in this area, it's going to be much better. And then, if I could go down that path for just a second, when you had these forces up to the north, they came with a system called the S-400, a really deadly surface-to-air missile system. Those are also located here and here, and with this area disappearing and them receding to the north, now you can have air activity much more robust with MiG-29s and Su-27s from the Ukrainian forces. And that's going to allow them greater freedom of movement. And also, the Ukrainians can reposition these forces in these areas to bolster their own activities. Big change over the last week.
Looking at all the disturbances in this part of the country, it looks like they're basically trying to run a path directly from Russia to this Black Sea ports, right?
Yes, sir. And if you look at what's left with regard to the Black Sea ports, you've got Odessa over here, and this used to be New Russia during the Catherine the Great era. And if you go into the mind of Putin, I wouldn't take it out of his game of play to try to link up his forces with those that are left in the Moldova area. And if he's able to do that, he'll cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea, cause them to be a landlocked country, and the resupply that they will get from this point forward will only be from the land.
We've heard some people talk in recent days that the Ukrainians may actually be winning. Do you believe that?
What does winning look like? So this is the question from both sides. And where will Putin stop? And how does Ukraine actually win this war? Is they continue to push back on the Russians. This area above Kyiv, that has been a huge victory for the Ukrainian forces. You're not seeing them say that because of all of the atrocities they're finding in that region. But being able to continue to focus their forces and push back on this Russian armada that's coming across is one of the greatest things that they can do. Bloodying the nose, continuing to force casualties onto the Russians is the best thing they can do. And what we can do in support, there's a couple of tactical sides. Okay. We've brought in S-300s that Slovakia has actually been generous enough to give. That's a really incredibly deadly system. It's not quite as good as the S-400, but it's got great legs, long range, and it can shut down the Russian ability to fly fighters into this region. And you're watching Russians, and this is one of the horrific things that happened this last week. They're firing missiles, long-range missiles, into train stations and the likes. And they're relatively precision guided, but this is one of the reasons why a no-fly zone would never have worked, because we go to strike where the launchers are, not the missiles that are coming back. And so when we think about this, what we can do, continue to resupply them with S-300s, as many of the missiles that we can from the Stinger and from the Javelin sense. And one other tactical thing we can give them is night vision goggles. They're easy for pilots actually to go in, don, and learn how to fly, and they can do that on the west side of this country. And then once they start getting comfortable, they can come up from low level and come up and pop the Russian assets as they come down. And this is something that we can do right now that our generals and our Defense Department would agree on.
Fascinating. JB.
Mike, a pleasure, always.
Thanks for your service. Thanks for your time today.
My pleasure, sir.
Appreciate it. New calls to expand the investigation into Hunter Biden. Our political panel weighs in. Coming up next.